In this video we're going to dive further into Webpack and we're going to learn how to include third-party JavaScript libraries such as HTMX and Alpine.js in our final bundle output. In addition to that, we're going to learn what Webpack Loaders are and how we can use them in order to include CSS style sheets in our final bundle, so we can also bundle CSS with our JavaScript into a single output bundle. We're going to cover all of that in this video, and this is a continuation of the previous video which is linked in the description, and there's a blog post for this video as well which I'll link as well. Now we're going to start by bundling third-party JavaScript libraries into this output bundle. Now this is a common scenario. You might be working with HTMX or jQuery and Select 2, or you might be working with full-scale React or Vue.js applications. Now when you're building applications, you often need these third-party libraries, and that's what we're going to use NPM to install in this video. So let's get started. Now in the last video we set up this Webpack configuration file, and you can see we've got an entry and an output. These are the keys defined in this module.exports object, and this configuration simply says this is the entry point, the file that we want Webpack to look at when it's bundling our application, and the output just tells us where to output the final bundle. And we've set up this assets directory in the Django application, and this contains the JavaScript files and also soon the CSS files for bundling and outputting into this output. Now in order to use Webpack, we've also initialized an NPM project, and we have a package.json file here in this folder. And at the moment we've got a couple of dev dependencies, that's Webpack and the Webpack CLI. So what we're going to do now is we're going to install new packages into this application. Now let's pretend we want to use HTMX and Alpine.js in this application. Now in my previous videos I've included these through a script tag and a CDN, and that can be fine for development, but in production you don't want to really be doing this. You'd much rather be serving that from your own server. Now what I've got here is I've got another terminal open, and it's in the same directory as the node modules and the package.json file. If we go back to the blog post, I'm going to copy this command here. It's an npm install command. An npm install, that's the command you use to grab third-party applications or packages such as React, or in this case HTMX and Alpine. So let's go back to the terminal here, and I'm going to run the npm install command, and we're installing htmx.org and Alpine.js into this project. And when that command finishes, you can go back to the package.json file, and you now see the two dependencies. This is a new object in this file, and it contains the two dependencies, Alpine.js and htmx.org. Now this dependency stuff, this is similar to Python's requirements.txt. It's a list of the third-party packages you need for your application. So what we're doing at the moment is we're using Webpack to bundle the scripts in our assets folder into a single output file, and that's in the core static directory. It's this bundle.js. This is the output from Webpack. And what we want to do now is we want to include the source code from HTMX and Alpine.js in this output so that we can use that code in our applications. For example, we might want to use HTMX attributes or Alpine directives and build Alpine components. In order to do that, we need the source code from these libraries in this bundle so that Django can then fetch it and return it to the client. And remember, in our template, that's the index.html template, we're loading the output bundle here using the static template tag. So we need HTMX and Alpine.js in this bundle.js. So how do we achieve that? Let's go back to the Webpack entry point, which is the index.js. Now this is the code we've got so far in this entry point. We're importing two modules, helper 1 and helper 2, and we also have an event listener here which is changing the text on the web page. Now if we go to HTMX's documentation, there is a section for installation. Now this contains the script tag that we normally use in the videos, but there's also a section for npm. This contains the install command that we've already done, and below that there's a section for Webpack. And as it says here, all we need to do is import HTMX into the entry point. So let's copy that command and we'll paste that into the index.js file. We're importing htmx.org, and it also says here if you want to use the global HTMX variable, which it recommends, you need to inject it into the window scope. So what I'm going to do is copy this window.htmx line here, and actually I'm going to replace the import with that line. This will require HTMX into this entry point. Once we've done that, we can save this index.htmx, and what I'm going to do in the other terminal, I'm going to clear that out and we're going to run Webpack in watch mode. If we cat the contents of the package.json file, you can see here the Webpack watch mode script all we need to do is run npm run dev. So let's do that just now, npm run dev. And what this does is it regenerates our bundle, and we've added HTMX to that bundle now. So if we go back to the bundle.js and we do a search for HTMX in here, we can see that we now have some references to HTMX. It's now included the source code in this output bundle. So how do we test that this works? What we're going to do is go back to the index.html file, and we're going to amend this content in the body here, and we're going to add something with some HTMX attributes and test whether or not they are working. So let's add a button here, and we're going to add the hxget attribute here, and we're going to hook up a URL to the index root in our application. So we'll use the URL template tag and reference the index URL, which exists already in this application. It's this one here. And that in turn will then send the request to this view, which simply renders the index.html. If we go back to the button now, we're going to do this on the hx trigger equals click event. And finally, we're going to use the outer HTML swap here. So that's our button, and inside the button we'll use the text click me. If you save that file, we should now be able to go to our web page, which is here. And if we refresh this page, we now have this button that says click me. If we click that button, you see the message hello here. Now, when you actually go to this web page, make sure you do a cache refresh so that the server refetches the bundle file from the server. You can do that with Command-Shift-R on a Mac or Control-Shift-R on Windows. And you can see that this is now working. HTMX is grabbing the backend content and replacing it each time. If we go to the developer tools, I'm on the network tab here. When we click the button, you can see the request is being sent to the back end. It's returning the content in the index.html, which is then continually being replaced into this template. So the bottom line here is that HTMX is now working, and it's working through this bundle.js that we're importing. And HTMX is present in that bundle because we've imported it here on line 4 in the entry point. Webpack sees that, and therefore it knows to include the HTMX source code in the final output. So if you're building a production application with Webpack, you now know how to include HTMX into that project and into your output bundles. So that's HTMX. What about Alpine.js? Let's go to the documentation for Alpine, and as it says here, there are two ways to install Alpine into your project. You can do it from a script tag, or you can import it as a module, and that's what we're going to do. So if we scroll down to this section, and I'll link this in the description, what we do is we install Alpine, which we've already done, and all we need to do is include these 3 lines of code in our index.js. So let's go back there, and I'm going to paste them in here. We import the Alpine object on line 3 from Alpine.js. We set the window.alpine attribute to that object, and then we call the alpine.start function. So if we save the index.js file, we should now see that Webpack, because it's running in watch mode, has regenerated an output bundle for us. And if we go to bundle.js and we do a search for Alpine, we can see that we're getting results, which means that Alpine is now included in our source code. So let's now test that we can actually use Alpine in our project. If we go back to the index.html file, we're going to create a small Alpine component here. It's going to just be a div, and it has the xData directive. This denotes an Alpine component, and we set that equal to a JavaScript object. And I'm going to include 2 keys in that object. We've got a 𝗖𝗵𝗽 key, which is set to false, and also a message, which is set to a string saying hello from Alpine. So if we close that div off, let's create a paragraph tag, and we'll use the xText directive to set the text within that paragraph tag, and we're going to set it to the message. And we're only going to show this paragraph if the 𝗖𝗵𝗽 state is set to true. So we'll use the xShow directive here, and we'll set that to 𝗖𝗵𝗽. And finally, we're going to include a button here that's going to allow us to toggle the value of this 𝗖𝗵𝗽 in the Alpine component. So when the button is clicked, and we'll use the click listener for that, we're going to set 𝗖𝗵𝗽 equal to the opposite of whatever it is at the time that the button is clicked. And we can use this syntax here. We set 𝗖𝗵𝗽 to the inverse of what it currently is. And this button can have the text of toggle. So if we save that and go back to the web page, when we hit the toggle button, we then see the message hello from Alpine. And when we click the button again, it disappears. So we're able to toggle the state of that 𝗖𝗵𝗽, that boolean. When it's true, it shows the message, and when it's false, it hides the message. So now we know that Alpine.js is actually working in this project, and through our Webpack entry point, the index.js file, we're able to include both HTMX and Alpine.js into our final output bundle. So when you're developing a large application in Django or any framework, when you're including a lot of third-party front-end libraries such as these, it's very useful to be able to bundle things together into single output files or multiple smaller output files. And through Webpack, you have a build process that allows you to take those libraries and generate these outputs. For now, I'm going to move on with this tutorial, and now we're going to look at Webpack Loaders. Now, Webpack is designed to work with JavaScript and JSON files out of the box. So without using loaders, that's all you can work with. But the real power of Webpack comes when you can use it with other assets as well as JavaScript and JSON. For example, CSS files or Sass style sheets, TypeScript files, JSX files, Vue.js files, and more. The official documentation states that loaders allow Webpack to process other types of files and convert them into valid modules that can be consumed by your application and added to the Webpack dependency graph. And if we cross to the documentation, as it says here, Webpack enables the use of loaders to pre-process certain types of files, and this allows you to bundle any static resource way beyond JavaScript. So in order to demonstrate the use of loaders, what we're going to start by doing is going to our assets folder here. And I'm going to include a style sheet here under the styles folder. So it's going to be called button-styles.css. So this is a CSS file. And what we're going to do is copy these styles that I've defined here in the blog for a button. We're going to copy them and paste them into this CSS file. Now all this does is make the background blue, it gives the text a colour of white, and it gives some padding to the interior of the button. Now the question is, how do we include a CSS file into our project? What we could do is go to the index.html, and if it was in the static folder, we could include this separately from our bundle via a link tag. But in our case, we want to include the CSS into this output bundle.js. How do we do that? So let's get rid of this link tag. And what we need to do is we need to install some loaders in our application in order to allow us to pre-process CSS files during the Webpack build process. If we go back to the blog post, it says we need 2 loaders that are typically used when you include CSS into your Webpack build. First of all, we have the style loader, which is used to inject CSS into the document, and therefore it allows you to include CSS files in your Webpack bundle. And secondly, we have the CSS loader. This is a separate loader from the style loader, and the purpose of this one is to resolve import and URL code within your CSS file. So these reference other files or URLs. The CSS loader will take care of resolving those in your final output bundle. Now these loaders, they are separate from Webpack. They're not included in the Webpack installation. So what we need to do is use the npm install command. And again, these are development dependencies, so we specify -d. We can copy that command and go back to our terminal here. If I stop the Webpack build process, which was running in watch mode, and we can paste the npm install command here, and that's going to install those into our project as development dependencies. Once that's finished, we can go back to the package.json file, and you should see these being added to the development dependencies. Now let's go back to the Webpack configuration file, and we're going to add a new key to the module.exports object, and it's going to be a key of module. If we go to the Webpack documentation for loaders, you should be able to see here that when we use a loader, we define a module object, and within that we have an array of rules, and these rules define the loaders in our Webpack build process. So what we're going to do is add that object now. So we have the module key, we now add an array called rules, and each rule is going to be its own object, and it's going to have 2 keys in this case. Firstly, we're going to use the test key, which we'll see in a second, and the second key is one called use. The test key defines which files to apply this loader to, and the use key defines the loaders that you want to actually apply to those files. So first of all, let's go to the documentation. You can see that this particular test, it uses a regular expression and it applies to all text files. What we want to do is apply this to all CSS files. So for the test key, we're going to use a regular expression, and we're going to look for all files that end in .css, and we can make that a case insensitive search. Now for those that don't know, in JavaScript you can define a regular expression with this / syntax. So we use the forward slashes here, and we use this backslash here to escape the dot, which is actually a character used in regular expressions. In this case, we want to actually refer to files that end in .css, so we need to escape that dot, and we also want to denote that this is the end of the file name, so we use the $ for that. So that's our test. We're testing for all files that end in .css. And for those CSS files, we want to use the two loaders that we just installed in order to transform those files into a format that can be used by Webpack and included in our final bundle. Now this array is evaluated from bottom to top. So first of all, we want to use the CSS loader that's going to resolve all the URL and import statements. And after those are resolved, we want to then inject the styles into the DOM, and we use the style loader to do that. So that's our two loaders that we're using to transform any CSS files that are included in our entry point or code that's used by our entry point. So let's go back to our web page, and if we do a hard refresh with Command-Shift-R, nothing has changed, and that's because even though we've used these loaders, we don't actually have any CSS files being included in our entry point, which is the index.js. Now, something strange you can do in this JavaScript file, because we've included this loader, we can actually import the CSS file directly into this JavaScript file. And now that we've used the loaders, Webpack's going to know how to use that and inject it into the document during the build process. So what we're going to do is create an import statement here, and we're going to do a relative import. We're in this scripts directory in the index.js file. We want to go to the styles and include the button styles.css. So what we're going to do is go back a directory, and we're going to go to the styles folder, and within there we can include the button styles.css. And if we save that code and go back to the page and do a hard refresh, we now see that the button styles are being applied, and that's because they're being included in our Webpack build process. The CSS is being injected into the DOM by the style loader, and therefore our buttons have the styles that we defined here in this CSS file. Now let's quickly add one more CSS block to this style sheet. We're going to include this block for paragraph tags, which is going to increase the font size to 24 pixels. Webpack's running in watch mode, so all we need to do is save that, go back and do a hard refresh, and you can see that the paragraph here, the text size has increased a bit. And by doing this, you can actually include as many CSS files as you want into the index.js entry point. Another common pattern is if you have, let's say, 10 style sheets within the styles directory, you might create a master style sheet called index.css, and then you can import all the code from the other style sheets into that one master style sheet. And then within the Webpack entry point, index.js, you could then import that single file, and that's a bit more maintainable than importing, let's say, 100 style sheets into one file. You can break things up using Webpack so that everything is a little bit more modular, and it helps you build more maintainable applications. So an example of this, if we created a text.css file here, and we can move this code here into that CSS file. So let's save that and move it here. What we can do now in our styles folder is include an index.css file, and in here we can use the CSS import statement to import the styles from the other two style sheets. If we go back to the index.js Webpack entry point, we can now import that index.css style sheet. So even though we've got multiple style sheets here within the styles folder, because they're all imported like this, we only need a single import. That's more maintainable for our application. So that's just a quick demo on how to use the import statement in a CSS style sheet. Now, as a final part of this video, we're going to learn a little bit about optimization with Webpack, such as minifying files so that they don't include spaces and comments and other attributes. Minification can be important. It reduces the size of your output bundle, and actually Webpack does this by default when it runs in production mode. If we go to the package.json file, you can see that we're running Webpack with this Webpack command, and we're specifying the mode as development. Now, if we change this to production, we're going to see that Webpack does a lot of these optimizations automatically, which is beneficial when you're actually putting your bundles into production. So if we stop the Webpack build process and restart now in production mode, and if we now go back to our bundle.js, you can see that minification has occurred here. It's reduced the number of spaces, it's eliminated comments, it's done these optimizations for us for nothing. All we need to do is run Webpack in production mode in order to get the benefits of this. And you can see some other things have happened here, such as reducing the size of the variable names. Here we have parameters such as e, t, and n. By doing this, Webpack reduces the size of the output bundle, and that means less data has to be transferred over the network when users come and fetch your bundle. And Webpack in production mode, it applies some settings to the Webpack configuration that allows it to do this for free, but we can actually do this in development mode as well. So if we switch this mode back to development, and then we go back to the Webpack configuration file, we can add a section called optimization. And this is another object within the Webpack configuration, and one of the keys we can specify is the minimize key. and we can set that to true. And this means that in development mode, we're also going to minimize our bundles. And because it's in development, we don't need to do this, but this is just to demonstrate this setting here. If we comment it out and restart the build process, this is going to bundle things without these settings, but we're back in development mode, which means that the output bundle is no longer minified. However, if we uncomment this here once again and restart the Webpack build process, we should now see in our bundle.js that again some minification has occurred. Not all of the optimizations that we've seen when we run in production mode, but basic minification and elimination of spaces, that has occurred, and all we need to do is add this setting here. So that's just to demonstrate the optimization block that you can use in your Webpack configuration. If you have specific requirements for production, you can use this block to customize what Webpack does in production mode. For now, let's just get rid of it, and we don't need that going forward. So that's all for this video. We've learned how to use Webpack to include third-party packages like HTMX and Alpine.js into our project. We've also learned how to include CSS files in our output bundles by using Webpack Loaders, and you can see that here we have loaders defined in this module.rules array. And we simply define a test for those and then apply particular loaders, in this case the CSS and the style loaders, to files that match this test. And finally, we learned that when we run Webpack in production mode, it applies automatic minification and optimization of our output bundle, which is useful for deployment because it minimizes the amount of data you need to transfer to your users. We also saw the optimization block of the Webpack configuration file and how you can manually minimize the output bundle using that minimize key and setting it to true. In the next video, we're going to learn how to use TypeScript with Django and how we use TypeScript loaders in order to compile or transpile TypeScript down to normal JavaScript during the Webpack build process. We're also going to learn how to use Webpack with files such as images and fonts, and how we can also use Babel to transpile cutting edge and new JavaScript into a format that's understood by all browsers. So that's coming up in the next video. That's all for this one. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. We'll see you in the next video.